Hello, everyone, and thanks once again for joining us now for this Monday's edition of Alaska Weather. And up first here we've got, let's see, there we go. Hazards weather graphic. We've got, let me see, let's get down to one here. There we go. That one shows the best area, covers the whole area that's got watches, warnings, and advisories. And I'll start with the warnings there. St. Lawrence Island and the Bering Strait coast, that's a high wind warning that kicks into effect Tuesday, tomorrow morning actually, and lasts the entire day tomorrow night and extends into Tuesday afternoon. Big storm coming up tonight into the area, moving northward and slowly eastward. Look for winds in the warning area there to pick up 30 to 40 miles per hour with gusts of 70 miles per hour. That's a pretty sure thing that that'll occur. As opposed to the watch, we've got a high wind watch there for Shishmaref, north side of the Seward Peninsula, northwest coast, Red Dog Dock up to Kivlina, Point Hope, Cape Lisburn, as well as the western Arctic coast, Wainwright and Point Ley. High wind watch, that's Tuesday afternoon through Wednesday afternoon for the same thing, southwest winds 30 to 40 miles per hour with gusts to 70 miles per hour. That's a possibility at this point, as opposed to the warning, which looks like a pretty sure thing. Also, for the Alaska Range, winter weather advisory continues until 6 p.m. this evening for additional snow, and then it should pretty much end and become lighter, which it's doing currently right now. Could pick up another inch or so, and then it should end, and that advisory will finally be over. And the same thing there in the northern panhandle, actually on the Klondike Highway above 2,500 feet. Snow advisory continues until 6 p.m. this evening for additional snowfall, and then that'll end as well. And from there, going to next graphic here, I snagged off the Fairbanks Facebook page, Understanding Winter Weather, and pretty good one here, under what is freezing rain. And freezing rain is liquid precipitation that falls into a colder layer that's shallow near the surface and then freezes on contact with cold surfaces like tree branches, wires, roadways, the whole anything surface of a car, as long as it's at or below freezing, and it creates a pretty dangerous coating of ice on roads, walkways, trees, and power lines. And when this occurred in my day, it was referred to as a silver thaw. Now it's referred to as a ice storm. And also, if the cold layer at the surface is deep enough, you can get liquid rainfall falling into that, and then the actual raindrop will freeze before it reaches a surface, and that's used to be known as sleet, which is now also known as ice crystals. And from there, moving on to the satellite imagery, and we can see last wave along that frontal boundary, or at least moving up into the southeast coast, northern southeast coast during the afternoon hours today, with clouds all the way down to the southern panhandle, and the next storm system pushing clouds up to the Kodiak Island area. Mid and high level clouds there, and now making landfall, at least the clouds are moving onto the south coast of the Alaska Peninsula, and still some pretty gusty winds out over the Bering Sea. But diminishing this afternoon as high pressure builds in, but the strongest winds reported on Unmak Island at Nikolsky with a peak wind gust out of the north at about 61 miles per hour, and that was by far the strongest wind gust I saw out there in the reports. Otherwise, rain fell along the eastern North Gulf Coast into the northern panhandle today, heaviest from about Yakutat on down to Latuya Bay and into Sitka, with much lighter amounts down to the south. And the clouds over the eastern interior there, mostly north of the Alaska Range, keeping snow going, but slowly ending from west to east and northeast there, and really becoming more intermittent and lighter and more of a showery or flurry condition there into this afternoon after several inches falling in some areas there. And then in a weak trough, moving on to the western Arctic coast, bringing another round of light snow and fog, a little bit of a pickup in the winds there. And for the outlook, or for the on today's chart, you can see the high pressure building over the eastern Bering Sea, as well as up over the northwest interior, with clearing skies gradually edging eastward there as the snow diminishes and pulls off to the east. It cleared out over Cook Inlet and at least the southern Susitna Valley, Matanuska Valley, Prince William Sound, and not too bad. Kodiak Island, basically a dry, light wind day there. But that warm front with that wave coming northward there into the northern panhandle brought moderate amounts of rain today. Yakutat picked up about 9/10 of an inch, as did Sitka. Heaviest amount, 1.5 inches, fell at Latuya Bay, and about 2/3 of an inch at Juneau. By contrast, only 1/100th of an inch fell down at Heidelberg. And then in the interior there, about 1 to 2 inches of snow fell today in that area from roughly Healy up to Nenana into the greater Fairbanks area, with some of that extending down earlier today in the Copper River Basin northward to the eastern Arctic coast. Barter Island, Kaktovik, seeing some light snow, and light snow into the northern Kuskokwim Valley, with showers earlier today extending all the way down into Dillingham, which rain and snow totaled to about 1/1300th of an inch there. But that's beginning to end, as it is over the Alaska Peninsula. Out to the west, gale force winds pushing into the western Bering Sea and the Aleutians, with rain ahead of that next frontal system. And tonight, it looks like storm warnings kick in for the western Aleutians into the western offshore area of the Bering Sea, including St. Matthew Island will eventually kick into the storm warnings late tonight, more likely tomorrow there, with a good shot of rain and warm air surging northward on those southerly winds. Otherwise, the frontal boundary continues to weaken, but keeps the rain and snow showers going along the panhandle, north coast, north of the panhandle, say Port Alexander, northward to Juneau, and eastward there to about Yakutat, and flurries over the northeast interior as clouds continue to diminish and clearing increases. Strong high pressure building over the Yukon and interior Alaska, and that keeps a tight gradient there along the western Arctic coast for gusty winds. Could see some areas of blowing snow both tonight and tomorrow. Strong high pressure just north of Eagle there, 1,050 millibars. That's right about 31 inches of mercury on an old-style barometer, or altimeter would be about 31 inches. And then snow and blowing snow, increasing winds actually push into St. Lawrence Island tomorrow afternoon, with the high wind warning there in the Bering Strait coast. That'll start out as snow, quickly changing over to rain with the warmer southerly winds coming in, and that'll extend all the way down to the central Aleutians. But light winds, mostly clear skies, or probably be variable clouds, won't be solid clear skies out over the southeast Bering Sea, Pribilofs, but definitely dry with lighter winds. Temperatures on the upswing. And looking ahead to Wednesday, high pressure, very strong, moves into the Northwest Territories, but still a strong ridge into the central interior areas. And on the south side there, some moisture works up toward Kodiak Island as that occluded front moves northward with increasing winds there, rain for the Alaska Peninsula, and late for the eastern Aleutians. And that front out west really weakens, just a narrow band of light rain with winds really lightening up now. Not even small craft advisories there with that over the central Aleutian areas. Periods of light rain there, and then the moisture area pushes west of St. Lawrence Island. If it barely reaches it at all tomorrow, may graze the western Arctic coast, but look for the high wind watch out for the western Arctic coast, Shishmaref, northern Seward Peninsula areas, with areas of blowing snow possible anywhere over the north slope on out to the Arctic coast, but basically dry conditions downsloping off the Brooks Range, definitely dry over the interior to the North Gulf Coast. Increasing northerly winds for the northern panhandle, and to a lesser extent down south, but dry conditions and partly to mostly sunny skies in the daytime hours. And for lows tonight, 30s and 40s for the panhandle, otherwise low below zero northern Kuskokwim Valley, 20s elsewhere, and highs tomorrow, teens Copper River Basin 5 to 15, Kuskokwim Valley 25 to 32 for Bristol Bay, lower 40s Kodiak Island, in the 40s for the panhandle, and 30s south central Alaska, followed by lows about the same the following morning, Wednesday morning, as Tuesday morning. Lower 40s Kodiak Island, 30s to near 40 in the Panhandle, followed by highs in the 40s, southeast coast, Kodiak Island, Bristol Bay, Kachemak Bay, Seldovia, Homer, Seward, teens for the northern Kuskokwim Valley and Copper River Basin. Lows 5 to 10 below central interior, warmer out toward the Arctic coast, in the 20s out toward the Bering Strait coast, highs 20s to lower 30s out west, and right around zero in the interior, milder on the Arctic coast. Lows on Wednesday morning about 10 on the eastern Arctic coast, warmer to the west, and 5 to 15 below northeast interior, near zero in the Tanana Valley, followed by highs a little milder, but still shade below zero there for Fort Yukon Arctic Village. And out to the west, lows in the 30s, followed by highs in the 40s for the Aleutians.
And now, aviation weather around Alaska.
Flying conditions not too bad for the day Tuesday morning. VFR Arctic coast right on down into much of interior Alaska, Kodiak Island, and from Atka up to the Pribilofs eastward along the North Gulf Coast. Some marginal VFR over the eastern interior north of the Alaska Range, and also some areas of marginal VFR, St. Matthew Island through the Bering Strait into the northwest interior, and also from Yakutat down into the northern panhandle. And then IFR with the strong system out over the far western Bering Sea, Shimia and Attu. And then for the afternoon forecast, that area of IFR slides a little bit to the east, as well as a marginal VFR there, now across Adak, but not reaching Atka. And that extends up into the Bering Strait. Otherwise, all of interior Alaska, VFR. Kodiak Island, marginal VFR with some IFR showing up from Sitkinak on up to Cape Chiniak and Pasagchak Bay, those areas, and some marginal VFR up to southern Kenai Peninsula. Right along the coast, probably will stay offshore though. And then Yakutat into Lynn Canal, Glacier Bay, Elfin Cove, marginal VFR over the remainder of southeast Alaska. And then on Wednesday morning, that weakening band of IFR slides over Adak, but stays west of St. Lawrence Island, St. Matthew Island. Good VFR again, interior Alaska, some marginal VFR over the Aleutian Range and Alaska Peninsula, down to Mount Nelson Lagoon. Marginal for Kodiak, Fognak Island. Marginal VFR now, at least possibly, as far north as Kachemak Bay, and that could slip up into Resurrection Bay, but staying south of Prince William Sound. And the southern coast of Prince of Wales Island could see some marginal VFR. Otherwise, VFR. And for Wednesday afternoon, northern interior, right on down to the Yukon River, Yukon Delta, VFR, although marginal VFR on the increase now over Cook Inlet, Kenai Peninsula, and into the southern Kuskokwim Valley, back to the southwest coast, Bristol Bay, and a little bit of marginal VFR slides into the southern panhandle. Otherwise, good VFR to the North Gulf Coast. IFR, Adak and Atka, otherwise marginal for the Bering Sea, but St. Lawrence Island, northward, VFR. Anaktuvik and Adigan, both passes most of the Brooks Range, in fact, will be VFR flying. And for the western Alaska Range, nothing but VFR for either approach, Lake Clark, Merrill, and Rainy. VFR for Windy and Isabel as well, VFR. The entire Alaska Range will be VFR tomorrow through the entire day. And Tanita looking good, VFR as well. And Portage Pass, VFR, either approach. Chilkoot and White, VFR as well. And for the freezing levels, big push of warm air with those strong southerly winds out over the western Bering and Aleutians. As you can see, 8,000 to 10,000 feet out that way, and 2,000 feet along the Alaska Peninsula up into Kodiak Island, and just north of the eastern North Gulf Coast, otherwise 6,000 to 8,000 feet over the southern Panhandle. Icing could be some areas of light to very isolated, moderate or mixed or rime icing, mostly light, just a chance there over the eastern North Gulf Coast, northern Panhandle, maybe the eastern Alaska Range. Otherwise, most interior Alaska icing free, with St. Lawrence Island getting clipped by that heavier icing threat that's moving mostly into the Russian Far East, as well as the Bering Strait. And for the jet stream, big high pressure area over the at least 33,000 feet there over the southern and southeast Bering Sea, flow up and over the top of that northeasterlies 80 to 95 knots there across Bristol Bay and the Alaska Peninsula, and then lighter southwest winds with stronger jet over Canada. 9,000 foot wind flow showing southwest 75 knots, west central Aleutians, and western Bering Sea up to 100 knots. And then 45 to 65 knots, western St. Lawrence Island, and just off the northwest coast, with pretty light winds elsewhere around the state. 2,000 feet or 3,000 feet. Stronger winds moving up to Kodiak Island, southern Kodiak Island at about 50 knots, and then that strong south to north flow there over the central Aleutians and west central Bering Sea up to 80 to 85 knots. But the strongest winds blowing into the Russian Far East, high pressure over the eastern part of the state, Panhandle looking good winds, turbulence, Kodiak Island, North Gulf Coast, and the Brooks Range and Seward.
Good evening, and thanks for joining us for another edition of Alaska Weather Facts. I'm meteorologist Dave Snyder, joined again by Eric Stevens of GINA, the Geographic Information Network of Alaska from the University of Alaska Fairbanks. And Eric, thanks so much for joining us again tonight.
Happy to be here, Dave.
Thanks, Eric. And we've been talking about the complex gathering of information from satellites, looking down on the surface of the planet, and some of those orbits around the planet work for Alaska, and some of them don't. There's a lot of challenges with those. How can we get better imagery for the poles and specifically for Alaska?
Right. Well, today we're going to talk about a very interesting kind of satellite orbit that has potential to be real helpful for the high latitudes.
Okay.
Especially us here in Alaska. Canadians, Russians, Norwegians will all be interested in this. The satellites are not in orbit yet. Now, the future is uncertain, but it's possible, and if this happens, it will be wonderful for Alaska. Okay. It's called the highly elliptical orbit.
Oh, that sounds
it's interesting. Yeah. And I think first, to help our discussion, we should get back to some of Kepler's laws and how do satellites work.
Sure.
Kepler's first law, an orbit of a planet around a sun or a weather satellite around the Earth is not necessarily a circle, it's an ellipse.
Okay.
And the highly elliptical orbit takes advantage of this aspect. We're going to put the Earth in one of the ellipse and then stretch one of the foci of the ellipse, and then stretch that ellipse out real far to make it highly elliptical.
And the foci is that bend part of the end of the ellipse. If you're going to stretch out a rubber band, that would be the center, kind of the stretchy part.
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay.
And then Kepler's second law says that the closer something is to the thing that it's orbiting, the faster it goes.
Okay.
We see this in the solar system, that Mercury flies around the sun real fast. Jupiter, much slower. Jupiter's further away, it's slower. Mercury's closer in, it's faster. This happens with weather satellites too. Even satellites like the International Space Station, it's pretty close to the Earth. It goes around the Earth in only 90 minutes. That thing is moving.
Fast.
It's only 250 miles away. So how can we take advantage of these two aspects of Kepler's laws of motion to get better weather surveillance of Alaska? And this highly elliptical orbit is going to be the approach. So we have with us today our friendly planet Earth and our simulated satellite, the lid off of this salt shaker
like
here.
Sputnik there. Yeah.
There it is. It's shiny, it's metal, it's space-worthy. And what we want to be able to do is, could you have a satellite hover over the top of the world, up over Alaska? You can't really do that. Geostationary satellites have to be over the equator.
Okay.
So how could we almost solve this? And this is the tricky part. Maybe should we tilt the Earth
Tilt
over?
the other, focus on the pole. That's what we're trying to accomplish here, right?
So here we have the northern side of the planet, and we're going to trace out the orbit of a satellite with this salt shaker lid here. Now imagine a highly elliptical orbit. So let's put the Earth in one of the foci of the ellipse, and we'll have an imaginary foci out here. So the satellite will not go in a circle around the Earth, but will be in this long strung out ellipse. So the satellite will go
kind of like a racetrack.
Yes, there you go, like a racetrack. So it's an oval elliptical shape like that. And notice now that when the satellite's over here, we've got a nice view of the northern hemisphere around. There's Alaska, Russia, Canada, Greenland, all there. So that's the ellipse aspect of an orbit, Kepler's first law. The second law saying that when you're further away as a satellite, you go slower. And this we can take real advantage of. Because the way this orbit works, when the satellite goes over Antarctica here, it's going to be close to the Earth. It's going to be moving, whoosh, goes on by. And then as it comes out here, it will slow down. This increases what is known as the dwell time. The satellite will just hang here looking for hours at Alaska and the high Arctic. And then eventually it will come around and it will accelerate and whiz around the South Pole and then come back and hang here for a while because it's further away from the planet. It goes slower. It has to. That's the laws of motion. and such like that repeating.
Wow.
Now, the real important way to make this work is you have to have two satellites. So that while one is whipping around the pole, you've got the other one out here, and they work as a team. You could then get a series of images of Alaska that can be almost from a constant frame of reference,
right.
and you can loop them together to make movies. You can take a picture every 10 minutes, say, of Alaska, and then loop it, playing it at several frames a second. You could see the clouds whiz on by. You know, the Weather Channel, weather broadcasters in the lower 48 especially can show these movie loops from the geostationary satellites. In Alaska, we've never really been able to do that very well, especially in the higher, most northern parts of the state, because those geostationary satellites over the equator, it's not a good view. And this highly elliptical orbit whipping around the South Pole and then dwelling up here would be a way for us to get that constant frame of reference and do really good weather surveillance over the Arctic, seeing where those storms are, where they're going. Nothing quite like a movie loop of the weather in time to really illustrate what's important, what's going on.
And compared to what we have right now, we just have small windows or snapshots of what's going on with the polar orbiters. We don't have that long-range view that's looking top-down to give us that complete motion picture that helps us understand so much of the atmosphere at this
There's
point.
so many different kinds of satellites. Each has their advantage. Each is important, and the highly elliptical orbit satellite will also fit into that scheme. It's a nifty idea to solve an Alaskan challenge.
That's fantastic. Well, that sounds really exciting. Again, kind of a satellite dream of the future to coming. Okay, very good. Thanks for joining us today, Eric. We really appreciate the information. And if you'd like to learn more about what Eric does at GINA at the University of Alaska Fairbanks, we invite you to visit the web address that you see on your screen there. For Alaska Weather Facts, I'm meteorologist Dave Snyder.
And now, marine weather around Alaska.
And coastal water forecast for the south coast of the Panhandle. Southeast winds 15 to 20 knots on Tuesday, seas at about 10 feet. Small craft advisories on the north coast for east-southeast winds 25 knots. Lynn Canal, variable winds 15 knots, northeast at 10 for Stevens Passage, and Clarence Strait, winds will be southeast at 10 knots with 5-foot seas. And for the day on, Wednesday, there we go. Gale warnings for Lynn Canal, northerly winds 35 knots, seas building to 7 feet. Small craft advisories for Stevens Passage, north winds 25 knots, and north winds at 20 knots for Clarence Strait. On the south coast, north-northeast winds 20 knots, and then lighter winds on the north coast out of the northeast at 15 knots. Prince William Sound tomorrow, Tuesday, north winds 15 knots. 15-knot winds for northern Cook Inlet as well. Otherwise, southern Cook Inlet, Kamishak Bay, the Barren Islands, and the North Gulf Coast, all looking at 30-knot northeast winds with seas running 8 to 10 feet. And for Wednesday, northeast winds 30 knots continue for southern Cook Inlet and Kamishak Bay with 8 to 10-foot seas. And for the Barren Islands, winds will be east at 30 knots with 11-foot seas. North Gulf Coast, east winds 20 to 25 knots. Prince William Sound, northeast wind at 10 knots, seas down to 2 feet. For Tuesday, Kodiak Island, gale warnings, northeast winds 40 knots. And for the Pacific side of the Alaska Peninsula, gale warnings, northeast winds 35 knots, 14-foot seas. Small craft advisories for the Bering Sea side of the Alaska Peninsula and Bristol Bay for northeast winds at 25 knots. And for Wednesday, Alaska Peninsula, east winds 30 knots. Bristol Bay, east winds 30 knots. Kodiak Island, east winds 30 to 35 knots with 12-foot seas. Eastern Aleutians, variable to northeast winds, 15 to 25 knots for the day on Tuesday. Gale warnings for the Central Aleutians, southeast winds increasing to 35 knots. Storm warnings for the Western Aleutians, south to southeast winds, 50 knots. And for Wednesday, Western Aleutians, northwest winds 20 to 25 knots, south to southwest winds 30 knots for the Central Aleutians, Eastern Aleutians, southeast winds at 20 to 25 knots. Pribilof Islands for Tuesday, southeast winds 25 knots, but storm warnings for St. Matthew Island, south winds 50 knots. Tuscarora Delta Coast, east winds at 20 knots, southeast winds 25 knots for the Yukon Delta Coast, and good gales for St. Lawrence Island, southeast winds 45 knots, seas up to 22 feet. And for Wednesday, For the southwest coast, southeast winds 30 knots, seas around 10 feet. For the Pribilof, southeast winds 25 knots. St. Matthew Island, southeast winds 30 knots. St. Lawrence Island, southeast winds 30 knots, and a southeast wind at 20 knots for Norton Sound with 4-foot seas. Eastern Beaufort Sea coast for Tuesday, south to southwest winds 20 to 25 knots. Central coast, southwest winds 30 knots, seas up to 10 feet, and gale warnings for the western Arctic coast for southwest winds 35 knots and 10-foot seas. And for the Chukchi Sea, gale warnings, south winds 40 to 45 knots, seas 8 to 10 feet. And for Wednesday, gale warnings continue for the Chukchi Sea, south winds 35 to 45 knots. Western Arctic coast also looking at gale warnings. South winds 40 knots and south 30 knots for the central coast. Eastern Beaufort Sea coast, south winds 20 to 25 knots. For tonight, look for some light snow, fog, and flurries with gusty southwest winds, possible areas of blowing snow for the western Arctic coast down to the northwest coast. Otherwise, high pressure dominating interior Alaska as light snow slowly diminishes and becomes more scattered and lighter throughout the night. Rain and snow showers on the decrease for the Panhandle, but won't end completely. Big storm bringing storm force winds out over the western Bering Sea into the western Aleutians, slowly moving eastward tomorrow into the central Aleutian areas. High wind warning out for St. Lawrence Island, Bering Strait coast, as winds could gust up to 70 miles per hour late tomorrow afternoon into Wednesday. And for the day on Wednesday, that system weakens, but high wind watch out for the northwest coast, northern Seward Peninsula, and the western Arctic coast for possible wind gusts of 70 miles per hour, resulting in some areas of blowing snow anywhere along the Arctic coast. And some rain looks like it'll push into Kodiak Island, but interior Alaska stays dry.
These forecasts are for planning purposes only. Call 1-800-WX-BRIEF for a formal pre-flight briefing. Always file a flight plan before you go flying. The U.S. Coast Guard Auxiliary urges you to leave a float plan with a friend or the harbor master before you go boating.